So one of my most anticipated movies for this year is NOSFERATU, directed by Robert Eggers. With the release of the trailer, it seems to me so far that he's got the right intent when it comes to the mood and atmosphere that this movie should have, treating Nosferatu's arrival like a demonic disease overtaking the city, very much like the original. So I figured it was no better time than now to revisit the classic silent film and talk about the aspects of it that make me feel like it's still one of the best films ever made, and certainly the best of the silent era. Something just fascinating to me is the pure legacy that this film has had. The image of Count Orlok is still more or less recognizable by people, and even if you don't know exactly what it's from, you have no doubt seen this image of this character, or even clips and gifs of various famous shots from the movie, like the shadow moving up the staircase, or him rising out of the coffin. Or maybe you just saw him on an episode of SpongeBob when you were a kid. NOSFERATU! But whatever the case, this is no small accomplishment to stay within the landscape of horror movies and the consciousness of the people that watch them, because the original Nosferatu film was released in 1922, literally over 100 years ago, which means that it should also be in the public domain, so I better not get any copyright issues from YouTube using footage from it, but that's besides the point. There's something kind of dreamlike and otherworldly watching a movie from this long ago. It's past a full human lifetime, so it's not only looking into the past, but it's a whole different world than anything that we would understand now. Movies are like these little time capsules, but in the case of early films like this, it really does feel like you're looking backwards in time. This was still during the silent film era, and its director, a man by the name of F.W. Murnau, a German man that served in World War I. After the war, with the rise of film and movies, there were a lot of outputs in what's known as the German expressionist genre. Types of films where the setting, architecture, and characters were very exaggeratory and hyper-realistic, very dreamlike. The most famous example being The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. But Nosferatu is also sometimes considered to be among them, although compared to the others it is pretty grounded, minus Count Orlok himself. I think the most widely known fact is that Nosferatu is actually an adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. To a degree, anyway, beating Universal and Bela Lugosi's version to the punch almost a full decade earlier. But Murnau did not actually have the rights to make an adaptation of Dracula, and even by changing the names of all the characters and moving the setting to Germany, well, it was still pretty obvious, and it was noticed by Stoker's heirs, and in turn, they sued the makers of this movie. And they even won the lawsuit, and they were ordered to have all surviving copies of Nosferatu destroyed. But thankfully, someone somewhere held on to at least one copy, because eventually Nosferatu would resurface, and it's still around to be enjoyed to this day. And it would technically make it the very first depiction of Dracula on screen. The story plays out similar to the novel, hitting on some of the major beats, but it actually focuses on very different things. Primarily, a relationship between its main character Hutter and his girlfriend Ellen, as well as the effects of the evil and darkness that Orlok brings with him as he arrives within the German town. First, Hutter is sent out by his boss to meet Count Orlok in Transylvania in order to sell him a house, setting up the recognizable scene of the real estate agent heading to Transylvania, being warned by all the townspeople to not go to the castle, and then eventually meeting up with the vampire. I wonder why every other name and location was changed from the Dracula novel, but they still kept Transylvania. That's just a dead giveaway that this is the Dracula story, but anyways, it's all classic stuff that you've seen time and time again, but just knowing the fact that this was the first one to really do it and put it out there makes it all the more fascinating. The stagecoach only taking him so far out of fear of meeting up with Count Orlok, the second stagecoach being helmed by Orlok himself in disguise. Apparently, they filmed at a real castle as well, so it's not on a stage, it's not a set. So when you watch it and it feels realistic, that's because it is. This is the 1920s, so saying that there was a limitation on special effects and budget is quite the understatement. Pretty much everything you see filmed was actually done. Count Orlok is played by an actor named Max Schreck, and if you're wondering why that name sounds familiar, even if you're not a silent film fan, well, it was the name of Christopher Walken's character in Batman Returns. That was Tim Burton's little tribute to this movie. Orlok might look a little silly to you for today's standards, but this design has been imitated in countless other vampire films since, and even in TV shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer with the Master. Its beauty is the simplicity. It's the hairless white skin, the elongated nose, the soulless stare, the long fingers, also the way the actor uses his body language of the stiff but striking movements, and it also played as an inspiration for Robert Englund portraying Freddy Krueger. He seems very much like this otherworldly entity, and the silence of the film just adds to the creep factor when he's stalking Hutter at night, or when he rises from his coffin on the boat ride and then wanders around the ship with this uncomfortable presence of darkness befalling all of them. There's no doubt in my mind that you've seen an image or gif of him rising up from the coffin here, and that's something that's been circulating for over 100 years. And this brings me to my favorite aspect of Nosferatu, and that's that Orlok isn't just a monster that attacks you physically. He's like a plague of evil that wherever he goes, he will infect those around him. Specifically in this movie, he brings a plague of rats with him, but the town is vastly unprepared on how to deal with this. There's widespread panic, confusion, loss of lives, and instead of Hutter becoming our Renfield-like character, it's his boss, who already looks like a creepy character before you even meet him or before he even starts to get possessed by Nosferatu, but he's the one that starts eating spiders and bugs and the one that the townspeople grow to distrust and resent and use as a scapegoat. The fear and paranoia of everybody who comes in contact with Orlok is what sticks with me the most out of anything else in this film. Dracula is a versatile character and he's been portrayed in so many different ways over the years, but few really capture the feeling that this movie gives you of him just being this force of darkness that's so strong that everything around him slowly becomes infected. Also, to my knowledge, this is still one of the first vampire films, so throughout the movie, you continuously get more and more lore explained to you. Nowadays, things like sleeping in coffins and sunlight killing vampires, it's all common horror cliches, but the discovery of each important piece of information in Nosferatu is treated with all seriousness. The characters are only just now figuring out what a vampire is, so it makes it a little bit more compelling along the way as you get new information. I'm not going to say the movie still holds up to today's standards. I mean, it's 102 years old, and even though the footage is restored, it still has that extremely grainy look to it. It's a little bit hard to see, even in the cleaned up versions. And the version that I saw, and I think the version that you're meant to watch, has this yellow and blue color tone to it, where the blue is supposed to represent scene shot at night and the yellow is supposed to represent scene shot during the daytime. But there are also versions where the entire film is just black and white. Spoiler alert for the ending of a 102-year-old movie, but anyways, it's very different from the novel, mostly because there's no Van Helsing character, and instead, Ellen essentially sacrifices herself to be fed on in order to distract Orlok long enough for him to be caught in the sunlight. And this is also the only time we see Orlok physically attack somebody in the movie, where the rest of the movie it's pretty much just implied or spoken of. But of course, back then, what you were allowed to show in a movie, well, that's up for debate. But the movie ends on a tragedy, in that Ellen, a pure soul, needed to die in order to vanquish the evil. It's a equivalent exchange, I suppose. But for the time period, I would say the whole movie is pretty dark. The only amount of levity and happiness that you have is in the first couple minutes seeing Hutter and Ellen's relationship in the beginning of the movie. The moment Hutter goes to Transylvania, everything becomes nightmarish and nobody gets to have a happy ending. So that, alongside having a character like Count Orlok himself, it definitely earns its spot in the long history of horror movies. This is something that you appreciate for its atmosphere and the fact that it's survived this long. There's so many lost films from the early days because preservation of them wasn't taken as seriously as it is now, and of course there was no home video or ways to distribute it back then. Nosferatu is a relic of the past, but it's informed so much within its wake. There has been a few remakes so far, like the 1979 version, or the meta take with Shadow of the Vampire about the making of the movie, where Willem Dafoe plays Count Orlok, who just so happens to be a real vampire that they filmed for the movie.
Don't think I can't harm you.
Tell me how you would harm me. And even I don't know how I could harm myself.
Also, ironic that Willem Dafoe is also going to make an appearance in the new Nosferatu remake directed by Robert Eggers. I know since the whole controversy was this was a Dracula adaptation with the names changed, so why not just make a new Dracula movie? Well, although it is true that Nosferatu is loosely based on the Dracula novel, within the past 100 years, Count Orlok and Dracula have really become separate entities in the ways that they are discussed and talked about. Movies like the Francis Ford Coppola Dracula, the adaptation gets very in-depth about Dracula as a character, but I feel like Count Orlok is more about Dracula as a concept, as a vessel of darkness and how those around him handle it. And also in a way, maybe that's more like the novel, since the book is from various POVs of people dealing with him. I guess the way that I separate it in my mind is that I view Dracula more like a full, well-rounded character. Someone with high intellect, suave with the ladies maybe, manipulative and in control. Whereas I view Count Orlok more like a force of nature, or maybe I should say a force from hell, an embodiment of plague and misfortune. And there's definitely crossover with both those themes, with those characters, but in my own personal headcanon, that's how I distinguish them as being different. But I think there is enough of a difference at this point, 100 years later, that it's valid to want to do specifically a remake of Nosferatu and not just call it Dracula. Like I said, Nosferatu has heavy themes of the relationship with its two main characters, and it also has more variety with how the townspeople respond to it, so they are still very different. Based on the trailer of the new Nosferatu, it seems like they have the vibe and tones down that I would want from a remake like this, so I'm hoping the best for it, but we'll still have to wait and see. Until then, I think the original Nosferatu is definitely worth checking out, and I know that sometimes it's a struggle for people to go back and watch old films, but I don't even think of this as a movie sometimes. I look at it like a time capsule viewing a piece of art that was truly capable of terrifying people 100 years ago. Something that you would want to have on in the background of your Halloween party or something. And something much like Dracula himself was meant to be destroyed, but rose up once again and since has never left our nightmares. So tell me what you think about the original Nosferatu down below in the comments if you have seen it, or just your experience with it, because even if you haven't seen it, I'm sure it's come up a time or two in your travels. So just talk all things Nosferatu down below. Talk about the remake from the 70s. You can talk about the upcoming film. Whatever you guys want to, I would love to hear your thoughts. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching this video. I do appreciate it. Please give it a thumbs up and a comment to help it out in the algorithm. Subscribe if you want to stick around and see more. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll talk to you next time.
NOSFERATU.